This is the Life at Work Conference podcast, an initiative of City Bible Forum.
Hi, I'm Andrew Laird, host of the Life at Work Conference podcast, where we meet real workers wrestling with real workplace issues. Today, disability and the workplace, and the important role Christians can play in making workplaces more inclusive.
It's not just about doing, inclusivity because that's the legal or political requirements, but I actually think it's because we're motivated by the message of the gospel and we want to demonstrate, the love and character of God in the world.
My guest today is Dr Louise Gosbell, Principal at Mary Andrews College and author of several publications about disability and the Christian faith. I'm Andrew Laird, and this is the Life at Work Conference podcast. Inclusivity is a big theme in modern workplaces, but are there areas of inclusion we might not be aware of? And if so, is it an opportunity for Christians to provide a powerful witness to the genuine inclusivity of the gospel? My guest today believes so, particularly in the area of disability. So welcome to the podcast, Louise.
Thanks so much for having me.
Louise, we're going to come to those issues that I mentioned in just a moment. But you have thought and you have written and you have spoken extensively on the topic of disability. Where does your passion and interest in this area come from?
So originally it came because of a particular incident that happened in my family. So I was at Bible college. I was finishing up a degree and thinking about doing an honours year. And I was trying to think of something to write about in this honours year and had no idea what I wanted to do. And it was interesting timing because my mother-in-law called me quite upset one day and she told me about something that had happened in their church. So my husband has a brother with Down syndrome. He was actually adopted into their family when he was a baby. His birth parents didn't want to have a baby with Down syndrome. So he was eventually adopted by my in-laws and had been involved in their local church ever since he came to live with the family at 2 weeks old. So by this time he was in his teens. He'd been involved in their local church community in a few different ways, welcoming people at the door, handing out bulletins, carrying in candles for liturgy and so on. But a new minister actually started at the church at that time and rang my mother-in-law and said that my brother-in-law was no longer actually able to do any of those things, not be able to welcome, not be able to hand out bulletins. And his rationale was that someone with an intellectual disability can't actually understand the gospel, so can't actually ever be called a Christian. And so it was my brother-in-law was asked to step down for those roles. So that was really the first time I thought, well, what is a Christian response to disability? If there are some people who genuinely believe that intellectual ability or disability can prevent you from being able to have a relationship with God. So that was my first kind of foray into the world of disability. Now I think it's even much closer to home. We have a teenage daughter with autism and other disabilities. And for me personally, I've been quite unwell and have ended up with a neurological condition. So it's been really interesting for me after writing in disability theology for so many years to actually having to adjust to that personal lived experience of disability for myself for the first time.
You raised there something we'll come to a little bit in just a moment about the different nature of disability. But obviously they're quite a painful and hurtful experience, and yet it has led to this wonderful exploration and work that you have done and continue to do in this area. Look, Louise, many Christians may not have thought very deeply about what the Christian faith has to say about disability. That was perhaps what was going on there for that pastor, perhaps, and really what triggered your interest and your research in the area. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of help getting started. What are some of the key strands of biblical teaching that would be helpful for us to grasp on this whole issue?
Well, I could talk about this topic for a very long time, but I will try and keep it brief for you. I think one of the key things that the Bible tells us about humanity, all humanity, is that we're created in God's image. So God created humanity to be his image bearers, to show the world his goodness and to demonstrate his character. And I think while, spoiler alert, that humanity sin and humanity then kind of failed to live up to God's directives in the garden, we still end up being God's image bearers. So even after the consequence of the fall, humans don't lose that duty and function to bear God's image. So, in Genesis 9, after the fall, there is this directive for humans to not take the life of another human. Why? Because all humans are created in the image of God and are therefore precious to him. I think all humanity continue to bear God's image, and that doesn't change because of a person's physical or intellectual abilities or disabilities. All humans are precious to God. I think there are definitely some tricky passages in the Bible when it comes to disability. Some of the healing passages can definitely be tricky for some people with disability. But I think there's also some really important statements that should form the foundation for us as we're approaching the scriptures and thinking about disability. So one passage I think is really key is in Exodus 4. And there's this really interesting exchange that takes place between God and Moses. So God tells Moses to speak to Pharaoh about releasing the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt. But Moses isn't so keen on kind of doing this task. One of the reasons Moses gives to God in trying to get out of it is that he actually says, I'm heavy of speech and heavy of tongue. While a lot of commentators say that Moses was actually just reluctant, or perhaps he was nervous about doing the task God called him to, there are actually a lot of scholars, and I certainly agree with this, that think it's possible that Moses is actually referring to some kind of a speech impediment here, and that's what makes him reticent about speaking. And what's really interesting is God's response to Moses then, when Moses says this. And God says back to Moses in verse 11, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? So disability isn't a surprise to God. It isn't a barrier. That means God says, oh, well, what a shame. If only you didn't have a disability. I'll find someone else then. It's actually not what God says to Moses at all. God is sovereign, and Moses' reluctance or a speech impediment, whatever this is, doesn't actually stop God from being able to be at work in and through human beings, despite any limitations or disabilities we might have.
I can see why you raised that passage there, Louise, because the implications for that are obviously profound in terms of really even addressing the issue that you raised just a moment ago that brought you into this area of research to begin with. And of course, you mentioned the image of God, that still being something that humanity bear, even in light of and after the fall. And perhaps that helps in some ways answer my next question for you, which is that I mentioned just a moment ago how inclusivity is really a Christian value. We have a God who embraces all. So just can you flesh out a little bit more for us how that idea, that truth feeds into your thinking about disability and the inclusion of people with a disability?
Yeah, absolutely. As we know, I guess the invitation of the gospel is available to all people. There are no restrictions on the message of the gospel in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity or socioeconomic background. Everyone is loved by God and valued by God. And I think this is absolutely the same when it comes to ability and disability. So we aren't loved more by God because we're healthy or strong or smart. And I certainly don't think we're loved less by God because we have physical or intellectual or mental limitations either. And I think that example of Moses is really key there. I think one of the most powerful things about the gospel is the way that it actually breaks down barriers. The greatest way the gospel does this, of course, is by breaking down the barrier that separates humanity from God. Because of Jesus, we're able to be restored in our relationship with God. But when people live out the gospel in their lives, we also see other kinds of barriers being brought down between human beings.
Can you help us just think through the different ways of thinking about disability? It's not a one-size-fits-all, is it? So, for example, I know some people with certain disabilities who actually embrace their disability positively. Perhaps most well-known for us is the Australian of the Year, Dylan Alcott. We've heard him speak about his disability in that way. Then there are others who might think of it in terms of impairment rather than disability. So just before we dive even deeper further into it, just help us to unpack a little bit the range of ways that people with disabilities or their carers, for example, might think about the issue and how to be sensitive to those nuances in our language particularly.
But I think you're really right. Disability is this really complex thing because you have a very broad range of different kinds of disabilities that people experience, and people experience those disabilities in different kinds of ways. So someone like Alcott is a wheelchair user, but he's actually also an athlete, and he's someone who's articulate and can advocate for himself. But disability also includes people with intellectual disabilities who might struggle to read or write, who find it difficult to advocate for themselves, and who might not even identify as having a disability. The label of disability covers this really broad range of people with lots of different kinds of conditions. And so it's just really helpful to be aware of how broad a range that really is, and that people feel differently towards their disabilities, and they can use different language to describe their own disability as well. So being sensitive to the language that people use to refer to their own disabilities, I think, is really important. So for some people, there is this real sense of disability pride. But others actually might shun the label of disability altogether. They don't always want to disclose it to people. I have a lovely, lovely friend who has an intellectual disability, and she often introduces herself to people by saying her name, and then she says, "I have an intellectual disability, but only just a little one."
Yeah.
And for her, it's because she actually doesn't want to be known by her disability. She wants to be known by her name, who she is as a person. She wants to be treated with respect. She wants people to know she's kind and caring. And the most important thing about her is all these characteristics. That label of disability for her is something she's seen as a negative. And so it's not the big thing that she wants to dictate her particular life and her identity. So just recognizing that that can be very different for different people, I think is a really helpful starting point. And it's only something you get to know as you get to know a person with a disability better, and you talk to them about their own experiences, and you can learn about different labels and the right language to use as you actually develop a relationship with someone.
Yeah, and that will obviously come from, first of all, having that awareness, but then perhaps being slow to speak and quick to listen and to ask those kind of questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, Louise, this is a podcast about daily work, so I want to turn our attention to that now. And you used that language a moment ago of barriers. So let's think about barriers when it comes to disability in the workplace. What have you observed to be some of the most common challenges that people with a disability might face when it comes to paid employment in Australia?
I think there's a range of different barriers that can make it difficult for people with disability to access employment. Some of those barriers are physical barriers, so do you actually have a workplace that has a ramp for people to be able to get in if they're a wheelchair user? Do you have accessible bathrooms for people who are wheelchair users or use mobility devices? But actually, it's easy to jump to physical barriers, but often barriers that make it harder are actually attitudinal and social barriers for people. So often people without disabilities make assumptions about the kinds of adjustments that might be necessary to accommodate a person with a disability to do a particular job. For some people with low vision, screen reading technology, large print handouts might be all they need to be able to do the job comparably as their able-bodied peers. But I think there's often this unfounded perception that it'll take more time, and effort than perhaps what it's worth to employ a person with a disability. But it does just come from a lack of understanding, I think. It happens because people don't actually take the time to get to know an applicant or an employee with a disability and find out the things that they actually need to be able to support them to do the job. And I say this all the time, but I really think that small changes that you can make in a workplace make a big difference to creating inclusive environment and pulling down barriers. So, do you make it standard that you offer large print documents? Do you use the right kind of fonts and font sizes on documents and PowerPoints to ensure visibility? If you've got someone speaking in front of a room of people, do you make them use a microphone instead of that classic, "Oh no, it's fine, I can speak loudly"? You might be able to speak loudly, but I guarantee you there's always someone in a room who's not going to quite catch everything if you don't use a microphone. So little changes like that actually make a big difference, not only for people who identify as having a disability, but people who might have undiagnosed hearing or vision loss because of aging and so on. So I think it's recognizing there are physical barriers, but very often the biggest barriers are people's attitudes, social understanding or misunderstanding about disability. So it's about growing in an awareness as your first port of call, rather than worrying necessarily as the first thing to go, we need to put in a ramp and accessible bathrooms. Let's actually have a think about the way we might do things in our workplace that might create barriers for someone with a disability being able to participate.
It sounds like a good point of application for us, in light of the things you've been sharing, is to be asking more questions and doing more listening rather than making assumptions, both in terms of how we speak to people, about people, and as you say, the barriers that might exist. Look, Louise, you've outlined some of the barriers there, so just unpack it for us a little bit. What's the data like when it comes to Australia? How good are we, or how bad are we, as the case may be, at having inclusive workplaces for people with disabilities?
Yeah, this is a great question, Andrew. So the data that we have from 2018 is that in Australia, only 48% of people with disability participated in the workforce, in comparison to 89% of people without a disability participating in the workforce. So there's an international organisation you're probably aware of called the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a bit of a mouthful, often gets called OECD. And they exist to sort of create policies for economic growth, efficient use of resources, improve economic well-being for people in workplaces and so on. And according to their data, they actually rank Australia as 20th out of 29 countries for labour force participation of people with disabilities. So for a wealthy, developed country, the number of people with disabilities in the workforce, Australia, is actually, it's very low. It's much lower than it should be.
So we have got a long way to go. There are obviously plenty of barriers that need to be removed still.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and look, it's removing those barriers that we want to turn to in just a moment's time in this podcast. In particular, the way Christians might actually be able to have a significant role in workplaces in doing that. But just before we do, one further question, Louise. Often when we think about disability in the workplace, and you've touched on this already, but we're not simply talking about people who might be born with a disability, but also those who might become disabled later in life, or even potentially have a disability because of a workplace injury. Is that right? We need to have that broad way of thinking about this topic.
Yeah, exactly. So disability, covers a broad range of things, as we've talked about. That can include people who are born with disabilities and have had, a lifetime with that disability, so they're very much adjusted to that. It can also include people who end up with an accident or illness or injury during their lifetime, which then requires significant adjustments to the way they're actually having to do things in their life, whether that's attending church, doing things in their workplace and so on. So that is going to impact someone's attitude towards their disability, but also how we might go about supporting them in the workplace as they're adjusting to a disability as well. Interestingly, in Australia, the current stats are that about 18% of Australians, so it's about 1 in 6 Australians who live with some kind of disability. So whether that's something they're born with or something that happens to them later in their life. So I think what's really helpful in recognising that is 1 in 6, that's actually quite a lot of people. So you might not always see something that makes it obvious that someone has a disability. For a lot of people, those are invisible conditions, so you might not actually be aware of it, but it does challenge us to think about our workplaces, our church communities. 1 in 6, is that well represented in our communities, in our workplaces, in our churches and so on? But I think it also helps us to realise, in some respects, the inevitability of disability. If it's 1 in 6 Australians, that means that it's inevitable at some point you're probably going to encounter someone with a disability in your workplace or in your church. So are we ready for that? Are we able to adjust to that? Are we ready to be able to recognise that there might be someone who is deaf or hard of hearing? people on the autism spectrum, people with mental health challenges, people with neurological conditions, like what I have developed over the last year or so. So I guess it's recognizing there's lots of different kinds of disabilities. People experience their disability differently, but it is helpful in recognizing that you're probably going to encounter this. It's pretty much guaranteed you will. So rather than thinking about disability as this kind of minority thing that happens over there on the side, away from all the rest of the able-bodied people, it just doesn't function like that at all. And in fact, the current data says that in countries like Australia, with a life expectancy of over 75, that the average person will spend more than 8 years of their life with some kind of disability. So that might be just, age-related hearing or vision loss, but it could be through something like an accident or illness. So disability really is pretty much inevitable, and it's part of the human experience. So being ready to make adjustments in our workplace, I think, is really helpful. Be aware of people's different needs, be prepared to make accommodations if someone needs it. And actually, I think to plan and prepare for diversity in the way that we run our workplaces in the first place.
Look, there's some really eye-opening and also some very sobering statistics that you've raised for us there, Louise. Lots for us to reflect on, but I think also wonderful opportunities, no doubt, for Christians when it comes to being leaders in their workplaces in this area, and of course the powerful witness that might be. And so we're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, that's exactly what I'd love you to help us think through there, Louise, the opportunities for Christians to be pulling down some of those barriers. But more on that in just a moment.
Sharing Jesus these days isn't easy. It can even make us anxious. How can we have better conversations, laying the foundation to speak about faith-related things and even disagree well? Join Caroline Spencer in Having Calm Conversations, a brand new 4-part online course that helps you reflect on how your conversations usually go and how you can grow in talking about Jesus with others. Go to citybibleforum.org/courses to access your free trial.
Well, welcome back. I'm talking with Dr Louise Gosbell about disability and the workplace. But Louise, we haven't really talked much about your work as principal of Mary Andrews College. So look, tell us a little bit about the college, what your work involves, and maybe how what we're talking about in relation to disability might intersect with your daily work there.
Yeah, so Mary Andrews College is a ministry of Anglican Deaconess Ministries in Sydney. So the college actually started over 130 years ago to train women as deaconesses. So the role of the deaconess was, based in parishes. They were women who were out working in the community, visiting the sick, caring for the poor, teaching scripture, really serving and pastorally caring for people in their communities. Since the late 1980s, the role of deacon was opened up to women, and so we no longer ordain people into the role of deaconess. But Mary Andrews College continues to be a training college for women in Sydney and now across the country as we have online learning, which has been a good thing for us. So we really specialise in training women for practical ministry roles with a focus on pastoral care. We do actually have a pastoral care and mental health institute which is connected to MAC, and we're really committed to help train our students in understanding mental health and mental illness, disability, chronic illness, and a whole lot of other different areas of pastoral care as well to prepare people well for their ministry experiences.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Look, Louise, before the break, we raised the problem. Now I really want you to help us with the solution, or at least beginning on that pathway towards bringing down those barriers. So tell us, what are some of the opportunities as you see it, whether they're big opportunities or small things that we might do, that where Christians are able to make a difference in their workplace so that there is greater inclusivity for people with a disability?
Yeah, I guess I talk a lot about the word inclusion. So we use this, and I often use inclusion as shorthand as a way of thinking about, having people with disabilities as part of a workplace or a church group, community, whatever it is. But I guess in reality, what we're really looking for is full participation. So it's not just about ticking off a list of things and making sure, yes, tick, we have a ramp, tick, we have a, accessible bathroom, because someone can actually be in your workplace and you can have all those physical things in place. But unless someone feels like they're fully integrated in your workplace, they really belong, they really feel like a full participant, that's so much bigger than just checking off a few things off a list. So you're wanting to say, to think more broadly about that. We might start with a list, but it's also about thinking, what can we do to ensure the culture, the way that we run things, is able to facilitate full participation for all of the people who are in our workplace. So it's not just about doing, inclusivity because that's the legal or political requirements, but I actually think it's because we're motivated by the message of the gospel, and we want to demonstrate, the love and character of God in the world. So I think we really should be motivated by wanting to model the way that the gospel pulls down those barriers that we talked about before. And I think our society works hard to build them up, to cause divisions amongst people. And as Christians, we need to work hard to pull those barriers back down. I really love the story in Mark 2 of the man with paralysis who's brought to Jesus by his friends. They're so determined to ensure that their disabled friend has access to Jesus that they literally pull down physical barriers. In this case, the roof of the house, to ensure that their friend has access to Jesus. And I think it's an important question for us to ask, how can we help to pull down barriers that prevent people from accessing Jesus or the message of the gospel? So while inclusion isn't just about a list that you tick off, it can actually be a helpful place to start with thinking about what you can do to make your workplace more inclusive and a better place of belonging for people with disabilities. I think it's helpful to think about recognising people's gifts and skills. And people with disability can often give you a perspective that someone else in your workplace might not actually be able to give you because of their own difference in experiences. So the reality is that God has created, everyone with different skills and abilities, and we don't want to miss out on having those gifts in our workplace just because we've sort of have a one-size-fits-all approach to, our employees.
Yeah, that's fascinating there, Louise, to think about it in that way, that what we do in our daily work could be richer for having the insights of people from a variety of different backgrounds, including people who are thinking about the issue or the problem we're trying to solve in our workplace or the product we're trying to design and build, who are coming at it with that perspective and that insight which those who may not have particular disabilities are not able to bring. And so there's incentive there alone to be having a diverse and inclusive workplace. But you mentioned there also the motivation of the love of God that we might have for all people, and the energy and the enthusiasm and the passion of those men in Mark's gospel in caring for their friend. So Louise, I'm wondering, what sort of witness do you think it could possibly have if Christians in the workplace are known as like those friends in Mark's gospel who are really passionate about ensuring that those with a disability are included?
Yeah, I think we have an incredible opportunity. I really feel strongly about that. Anyone who knows me would have heard me say this many, many times, but I really think the church, that Christians have an amazing opportunity to be a witness on this front. There was this huge report that was done in 2009 by the Australian government called the Shut Out Report, which really examined the experiences of people with disability in Australia. And, that report talks a lot about the kinds of barriers and exclusions and the challenges faced by people with disability in Australia. Many people share about, really horrific stories of exclusion and disenfranchisement in all areas of their life, in work, in accessing goods and services, in equity in education, and so many other things. And I think here is this amazing opportunity that Christians have to be a witness, to show something very different to the exclusion and disenfranchisement that people with disability experience in broader society. So more than just kind of ticking off that list, we do have this opportunity to model, I think, what is the transformational nature of the gospel in valuing all people and recognizing people's gifts and the contributions people can make to our workplaces. We love because God first loved us. And so this is one way we can help demonstrate that love of God in the way that we run our workplaces, not just seeing people as a burden or a problem, but seeing all people as God's image bearers who have something valuable to actually offer our workplace communities.
And given those OECD figures that you mentioned a short while ago, there are obviously lots of opportunities for Christians to get into this space and be doing things in advocating for and championing the cause of people with a disability and seeing them included in the workplace. So perhaps, Louise, if there was just one small, tangible thing that a person could do today when it comes to their workplace or in relation to their colleagues that might make a difference and model that inclusive nature of the gospel, what would you suggest to someone?
Yeah, well, as I've said a few times, I think really the best thing that you can do is build relationship and ask questions. You know, I think it starts with a conversation in your workplace, whether you already have people with disability there, whether you don't have anyone who identifies or who has publicly identified as having a disability. I think starting a conversation with how well your workplace supports people with disabilities or could support people with disabilities is a fabulous place to start. You know, what systems do you have in your workplace for someone to disclose a disability and request support? Is it easy for them to do this? You know, is there a feeling of stigma if someone needs to ask for disability support? Often that can happen in workplaces. You know, do you make people publicly declare this, or is there a system where someone can confidentially speak to someone about their mental health issues and the kind of support that they might need, for example? So thinking about how well is your organisation already doing on these fronts. So I think you could start that conversation casually over lunch, you know, but I also think if you're a boss or an employer, you could actually be a lot more intentional about starting that kind of conversation with your employees, you know, sending out an anonymous questionnaire and asking people's thoughts on disability inclusion. You know, later down the track, you might do a full audit of your workplace or, you know, run inclusion training or something like that. But I think the best place to start is just opening up that conversation and showing that it's on your radar and something that you're interested and committed to. Again, not just ticking boxes, not just filling quotas, but actually committed to wanting to see a diverse workplace because God has created humanity in its full diversity, and we want to see that represented in our workplaces.
And is that as simple as perhaps asking a question of someone, are there ways in which we could improve the way that we are inclusive of people with a disability in this workplace, whether it's yourself or other people? Are those the sort of simple questions to ask?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, you know, if someone has, a disability and that's a well-known thing, they're happy to talk about that. You can ask them respectfully. I would always want to make sure people are doing that respectfully, you know, not in front of everyone. Perhaps you might do a one-on-one, can I casually ask you, and ask for their permission to be able to talk about it. Can I ask you about this? The reason I want to talk about this is because I'm hoping we can do better. So it's not just, you know, prying about someone's disability, recognizing that under the Disability Discrimination Act, you know, you do have to be careful about the way you talk about it. But generally, in my experience, when you do that respectfully because you're absolutely committed to wanting to make change, then you'll find that people respond positively.
Look, Louise, I really hope that this has been an eye-opening and challenging and yet also encouraging conversation for those listening. And wouldn't it be wonderful if in 5 years' time we were to see Australia rising up in those OECD rankings as an end in itself, but particularly if Christians around this country had a significant part to play in making that happen. So there's a great encouragement, a great challenge, I think, for us all listening to this today. So thank you so much, Louise, for sharing your wisdom and your personal experience as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate that this is a topic that's on your radar, Andrew.
Pleasure. Look, thank you also for you listening, joining us in this episode. Our next episode will land in your podcast feeds in a fortnight, and we're going to be joined by one man who's had quite a remarkable career and how his faith has shaped and directed him each step along the way. So you don't want to miss his story. But look, until next time, I'm Andrew Laird, and you've been listening to the Life at Work Conference podcast.
The Life at Work Conference podcast is produced by City Bible Forum. To find out more and register for the conference, go to citybibleforum.org/lifeatworkconference. Enjoyed this podcast? Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing and leaving a rating so others can find us too. Join us next time on the Life at Work Conference podcast with Andrew Laird.